Okay, so the Bellinger course is what do economists study about individuals or nations? That's what we entered into the chat. And so we mentioned some of the things from yesterday. And of course, economists try to study society and the choices it makes. And some of the studies that they complete helps us determine exactly what type of economy we should have. And in the supplemental, you of course, after you clicked on that file and opened up and made a copy, you saw some of the different types of economists and what they believe about the choices we make as a society, including Adam Smith and Karl Marx, two very important economists that we reference in order to determine what type of economy we might have. So let's look at the notes, particularly different types of economies. So the first thing that we want to do is answer three basic economic questions. Three questions when we determine what type of economy that we're going to have. The first one of these questions is what goods and services should be produced? So, what exactly do we want to make as a society? The second one, after what goods and services should be produced, would be how. How should we produce them? So, what should we produce and how should we produce them? The third one would be who consumes. So, who consumes the goods and services? Who consumes the goods and services? And the answer to those questions isn't necessarily as important as how we answer them. So, how we answer these questions is incredibly important. Thank you. So, how we answer them. And how we answer them is also determined by what kind of goals that we have. And so every society must decide what types of goals and values it has. In the United States and other capitalist countries, one of our most important goals is economic freedom. Economic freedom. In other words, the ability for people and businesses to make decisions themselves about what type of economic decisions they want to make. So businesses and people get to decide what type of products to make, if they should or should not buy them, how they should be produced, and so on. So it's really up to the people to decide. Another goal of capitalist systems is economic efficiency. Economic efficiency, meaning that we should maximize the use of resources. Maximize the use of resources. So people are allowed to sell their labor with only some limitations. There are limitations placed on age, obviously below 16 or 14, depending upon the job. And there are some safety regulations, for instance. But other than that, we try to encourage the maximum use of resources. So efficiency is one, freedom is another. In fact, economic freedom is greatly linked to American patriotism, because if you think about it, one of the reasons why we had the war for independence was over taxation, which many viewed as limiting economic freedom. Other countries have different values. For instance, countries like China value equity. EQUITY. They think, for instance, it's more important that everyone in their country receive at least some services. That's more important than whether or not their people have maximum freedom of expression or voting. And so they value equity instead. But the problem is when you do value equity, it means that you decrease the amount of efficiency and freedom in a system. And the opposite is true. The more freedom and efficiency you have, the less equity you have. When you have lots of freedom and efficiency, there are going to be winners and losers in an economy. Over the years, we have seen a number of different systems develop, although we can often trace our roots back to certain ones in particular. So there are different types of economic systems. Most of us start off, actually all of us, you could say this, start off with what we call a traditional economy. A traditional economy. A traditional economy is one in which people rely on manual labor, bartering, and customs. So chances are you're probably going to do the same job that your parents did, that their parents did, that their parents did, and their parents did. So most of human history, this is how the economy existed. Eventually, though, people started to advance themselves. And so we entered into what is known as a market economy. A market economy. In a traditional economy, you basically just produced enough for yourself and maybe a little bit to trade with, and that was it. But by the time a market economy takes place, we've domesticated many plants and animals. We've managed to craft tools. And so now we're able to create a surplus and maybe sell that for a profit. So more people, in other words, can participate in a marketplace, hence a market economy. So people can start to produce and exchange goods and services. When there is little or no government involvement, we refer to a market economy as free market. As free market. So you often hear that phrase. And often you hear free market and capitalism interchanged. But of course, there are also those that think a government should make major economic decisions. As economies grew and industrialization occurred, many people started to think, well, maybe the government should become involved, especially since we had things like World War I and World War II. Whenever the government is making economic decisions, we refer to that as a command economy. A command economy. So in a command economy, the government is making most economic decisions. Now, is it possible for a 100% government controlled economy to exist? And the answer is no, of course it isn't. Even in North Korea, one of the most command oriented economies in the world, people still make individual decisions. Is it possible to have a 100% free market economy? And the answer is no, because as soon as you pass any laws, no murdering allowed. Now someone can't sell their services to go out and murder other people. So you've limited economic decision making. So, yes, that's why it has to be in the black market then. So, in other words, even though we use these terms, free market and command economy, there's no country that's really 100% one or the other. So technically, all countries are in a forced system now, a mixed economy. So a mixed economy has aspects of market and command. So let me just add a picture here. So what we end up with instead is some kind of spectrum, as you can see up here on the screen. The spectrum might have a planned economy way over here on the left, for instance, a free market economy way over on the right. And you can see that countries that are closer toward the command end of the spectrum would include North Korea. And then way over here, more toward free market, might be the United States and Japan. And there are some countries that have a little bit more government control. For instance, maybe they provide free college tuition and health care. So France and Sweden aren't necessarily as free as the United States and Japan. And then China has been moving more toward having people own their own homes and businesses. So they're not as command oriented as North Korea. So it is possible to be at different points on the spectrum and for countries to move. China used to be over here. They moved more toward the right. The United States, obviously, 100 years ago, didn't have minimum wage and child labor laws, so it was closer to the pure competition end of the spectrum. So it is possible for countries to switch where they are. And I'll finish up by talking about the two economists that are also in the supplemental reading. The first one is Adam Smith. He pointed out that self-incentives like profit motivated people. Self incentives like profit motivated people. He also believed that competition made better workers and goods and services. Competition made better workers, goods, and services. There's an assistant manager position opening up at Little Caesars, and so you're going to work maybe a little bit harder than your fellow employees so you can get that position. A company has a competitor in town, and so they're going to try to offer maybe better prices or better quality for the product, so that way people come to their store instead. He also believed that the marketplace automatically fixed itself. The marketplace automatically fixed itself. If a company has prices that are too high or their products are low quality, people aren't going to go there. And so it's going to pressure the company to make changes. Supposedly, if a company doesn't pay you enough, they'll have a hard time finding employees, so they'll eventually raise their wages. He referred to this as the invisible hand, the metaphorical object that fixed and weaved the economy without interference. So since he thought the economy fixed itself, he thought there was no need for the government to become involved. No need for government involvement. This is known as laissez-faire. Laissez-faire is spelled Laissez, Laissez, second word Faire, Faire. Now that's a term that can be applied to many things. In government, laissez-faire leadership means that you let people do their own, you don't micromanage at all. And in economics, it means that the government is not that involved. The other person that I'll mention would be Karl Marx. Unlike Adam Smith, Karl Marx will also have an impact on history and sociology and many other aspects, and politics as well. Marx and his co-author, who often gets forgotten by the name of Engels, they wrote the book The Communist Manifesto, one of the most widely read books in the world. Marx thought that people were greedy and materialistic. He also believed that rich people use these things to control the poor. Today, for instance, he might say wealthy people like Mark Zuckerberg and Bill Gates and others involved in technology and social media use smartphones and apps and games and messaging to distract people from the real world, so they don't realize that all this money is being taken by just a few people. So he believed a lot of things were used to do that. He thought alcohol, drugs, religion, all kinds of other things were devised by wealthy people to distract the poor from their reality. And he basically separated people into two groups. One group was known as the proletariat, which is spelled Proletariat. Proletariat. The proletariat were the workers, the working class. In many other countries throughout the world, the working class is also known as the lower class, except the United States. In the United States, everybody is part of the middle class because that's the way we like it. The other group were the bourgeois, Bourgeois. Bourgeois. And the bourgeois were the people that owned the means of production. They owned the means of production. He thought once countries industrialized, the proletariat, the workers, would realize that they've been basically reduced to almost robotics. They were doing these mechanized jobs in an assembly line, repeating the same thing over and over and over again. They no longer had any ownership over their labor. He said in the past, people would fashion their own goods and services. They would carve and be blacksmiths and mold certain metals. They would actually have a hand in what they made. But now they were just like the machinery they were working with. And yet they were making all of these things, massive amounts of goods, but receiving very little wages for it. So he thought what would happen once a country industrialized is they would rise up and seize control of the means of production. And he pointed out that they could do that in two different ways. They could either violently revolt or they could do that through elections. When they seized the means of production, he believed they would then set up a socialist society where working would benefit society. It would benefit everyone. And so that's where we would see a command-oriented economy. The people, if they violently revolted or through elections, would now control everything, including the government. And the people, through the government, would now own all the factories and businesses. So a command economy is the same thing as a socialist economy, a real socialist economy. So North Korea, Cuba, the Soviet Union, and so on, technically they had, according to Karl Marx's theories, a socialist economy. Eventually, he theorized, people would start working to better the community. People would start working to better the community. So they wouldn't go off to work to build up large amounts of money so they could buy a boat. Instead, they would work hard to better the community. Once that happened, he believed we would enter into a communist state. A communist state. During this stage, he believed, since no one was working for greed anymore, then we would see a lot of crime and war disappear. He thought the only reason why people often commit many crimes and the only reason why wars happen is because of greed. But if people are working to better their community, they're not working for greedy purposes anymore, then therefore there really wouldn't be a lot of wars or crimes committed. So actually, under a communist state, Karl Marx thought there really wouldn't be a need for much government at all. He thought that we would need very little government. underneath the communist stage. And so the closest you can really get to this in reality is something like in an Amish community. The Amish, when they're dealing with outsiders, are very much capitalist. They sell goods and services, but inside their community, they help each other out and they do things to better the community. But as we know, on a large scale, this is difficult to do because during the socialist stage, it's easy for a person or a group of people just to keep control over everything. And that's what often happens. Stalin, then the other leaders, eventually Mao Zedong, Ho Chi Minh, Fidel Castro, they all want to keep control. And so they never really let their country get to the communist stage. What they do instead is they call themselves communists to make them think that they've been successful, but really they're still stuck in that socialist stage where the government controls everything. So that's ultimately why communism fails, because they never actually get to that last stage in reality, because people like to keep control. So that's all the notes for today. We'll finish talking about different types of economies when we come back. Don't forget to submit the supplemental when you're done. And of course, there's the reading as well.